If your wife calls from her trip saying she misses you, but your phone shows her missing you with him in real time, what do you do next when blocking her isn't revenge anymore? It's the first move in a 30-day collapse of her entire story. My name is Deacon, and I used to believe distance was the safest place for a marriage to breathe, because space lets small arguments cool down and lets two adults remember they are not enemies. But that belief only works when the person on the other end of the distance is still playing by the same rules. The night my wife left for her so-called trip, she stood in our hallway with a suitcase that looked too light for a week away, kissed my cheek like it was a checkbox, and said she would call when she landed, and I watched the door close behind her with the calm of a man who trusts the shape of his life. I had plans, boring plans, the kind that make you feel like you are building something steady, and I told myself I would spend the week catching up on sleep, work, and the quiet chores that never get done when you live with someone who turns the house into a stage. Raina loved the stage, loved the way people leaned toward her when she spoke, loved the way the world made room for a woman who never looked uncertain, and for years I mistook that confidence for loyalty because it felt strong, and I wanted to believe strong meant safe. On the first evening, my phone buzzed while I was rinsing a coffee mug, and I saw her name light up my screen like a familiar signal, and I wiped my hands slowly as if taking my time would somehow make the call less important. I answered and heard her voice come through warm and soft, the voice she used when she wanted me to relax, and she told me she was tired. She told me she already missed me, and she told me the hotel bed felt wrong without me in it. It was a good performance, and I could admit that even then, because Raina never did anything halfway when an audience existed, even if that audience was only one man on the other side of a phone. I could have said something sweet back, something automatic and safe, but there was a strange hesitation in the way she said my name, a slight delay like she was checking a script in her head before she spoke, and that delay hit my nervous system harder than any accusation ever could. I kept my voice even, asked how the flight was, asked if she ate, asked what the weather was like, because routine questions are what couples use to reassure themselves that nothing is wrong, and she answered quickly, almost too quickly, giving me details that sounded fine on paper but felt slippery in the mouth. She said she landed late, said the shuttle took forever, said she was exhausted, and then she laughed lightly and told me not to worry because she was just going to shower and sleep. I said I was glad she called, and I meant it, because I wanted the call to be real. But as she spoke, I heard something in the background, a muffled beat of music that did not belong to a hotel room, and then I heard a man's laugh, faint but distinct, and Raina's voice tightened for half a second, like she knew I heard it too. She recovered fast, asked me what I was doing, teased me about eating junk food while she was gone, and I played along because I was still trying to be a husband instead of a detective. I told her I was just cleaning up, that I would go to bed early, and she said she would call in the morning, and then she ended the call too quickly, like she had to get back to something she could not risk naming. For a minute I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, staring at the dark screen, listening to my own breathing, and feeling the first thin thread of dread tighten around my ribs. I have a mind that likes patterns, and patterns do not need proof at first. They only need repetition and timing, and something in the timing of that call felt wrong. I told myself it was nothing, because that is what you do when the truth would cost too much to accept. I told myself she was tired, that airports are loud, that music comes from everywhere, and that I was being paranoid because I was alone in a house that suddenly felt too quiet. I tried to return to my evening like a normal man, but my hands kept moving in slow motion, as if my body was stalling while my brain tried to decide what reality it was going to live in. I put dishes away, checked the locks, turned off lights, and walked through rooms that held traces of her, a cardigan on the chair, a hair clip on the counter, her perfume lingering near the bathroom sink, and those traces used to comfort me. But that night, they felt like props left behind after a performance ends. When I got into bed, the mattress felt wide and flat, and the ceiling above me looked unfamiliar, like the house had shifted into a new version of itself without warning. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying that faint laugh, that music, that clipped ending, and the more I tried to push it away, the more it returned, sharper each time. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again, and I felt a quick rush of relief because a second call would mean she was thinking about me. But it was not her. It was a notification from an app I barely paid attention to, a merchant alert tied to one of our shared payment methods. The message was simple, neutral, almost polite, and it told me there had been a charge at a place whose name I recognized because it was not a hotel restaurant or a quiet cafe. It was a lounge bar near the waterfront, the kind of place you go when you want to be seen, not when you want to sleep. For a moment, I just stared, waiting for some benign explanation to appear in my mind, because my brain was still trying to protect my heart from the simplest conclusion. Maybe the hotel used a third-party vendor. Maybe the bar name was part of a larger venue. Maybe she bought bottled water at a kiosk with a confusing name. But the longer I stared, the more ridiculous my excuses sounded. Raina was careful with money when she wanted to be careful, and she always warned me when she used shared accounts while traveling, because she liked the ritual of appearing considerate. That night, there had been no warning, and the charge time matched the moment I had heard music and a laugh behind her voice. I got out of bed slowly and walked into the living room where the darkness felt thick and private. I sat on the couch, opened the notification again, and checked the details with the calm hands of a man who does not want to tremble. The charge was real, the time was clear, and the location matched the kind of night she claimed she was not having. I could have called her then, could have demanded an explanation, could have tried to catch her off balance while she was still out, but I knew Raina's skill set, and it was not honesty, it was recovery. If I called her in the moment, she would lie with the urgency of survival and then spend the next day building supports around that lie, and by the time I could challenge it again, her story would have witnesses, sympathy, and rehearsed lines. So I did what I always do when I sense danger, and I cannot afford to react emotionally. I stayed quiet, and I watched. The next morning she did call, earlier than I expected, and her voice was soft again, almost affectionate. And she told me she slept terribly and missed me more than she thought she would. She said she was going to spend the day doing boring travel things, meetings, errands, whatever cover story she wanted me to imagine, and she asked me if I missed her too. I answered with the kind of careful neutrality that makes people assume you are calm, and she seemed relieved by that, because Raina always did better when she believed she was still in control. We talked for a few minutes, and she asked about my day, and I gave her nothing that mattered, and when we hung up, I stood in my kitchen and stared out the window like a man watching weather roll in. I did not dig through her devices, did not break passwords, did not play spy games, because I do not need illegal access to learn what a careless person is doing in public. People who lie rely on the assumption that the truth stays hidden, and most of the time it does, because nobody wants to look. I opened my own phone and checked the only place where people like Raina forget to guard themselves, because they believe it is harmless, because they believe it is social, because they believe it is temporary. I checked public stories. It took less than a minute for my world to tilt. A mutual contact, someone in Raina's orbit, had posted a short video clip from the previous night, a laughing crowd and bright lights and the kind of music you do not hear in a hotel room. The clip was tagged with the venue name, and the location was pinned like a smug little flag, and in the background of the video, not centered, not posed, but unmistakable, was Raina. She was not tired, not alone, not curled up in a wrong bed missing me. She was leaning into a man with the comfortable closeness of someone who had been leaning into him for a while, and her mouth was near his ear, and her hand was on his chest like she belonged there. He turned his face slightly, smiled, and I saw the side of his profile under the flashing lights, and I did not need more than that, because I recognized him. Grant Hale. He was not family, not a childhood friend, not some harmless stranger she met on a plane. He was a man I had seen before in the edges of her life, a vendor contact who showed up at her workplace events, the kind of man who shook hands too long and laughed too loudly, always performing competence and charm. I had once joked that he looked like a man who collected favors the way other people collect watches, and Raina had smiled thinly and told me not to be ridiculous. Now in that video, I watched her look at him the way she used to look at me, and something cold settled behind my eyes. I saved the clip, not because I planned to share it, but because I wanted the date and timestamp anchored in my control, not floating in someone else's temporary story. Then I took a screenshot of the tag, the venue, the time, and I stared at it until my anger turned from fire into steel. In that moment, I understood something important about Raina. She did not just lie to me, she lied with confidence, and confidence is always a choice. She called me to say she missed me while she was standing in public, laughing with him, and she did it because she believed I was a background character in her story, the safe husband waiting at home while she sampled whatever excitement she thought she deserved. I did not yell. I did not slam anything. I did not pace the room like a wounded animal. I sat down at the kitchen table, placed my phone on the wood, and watched my own reflection in the dark glass for a moment. I looked tired, older than I felt, and I realized I had been tired for longer than I admitted, tired of the subtle humiliations, tired of being treated like the stable object in her life that exists to hold her up while she spins around. If she wanted a man who would explode, who would beg, who would scream, she married the wrong person. She called again that afternoon, and her voice was even sweeter because she was sensing distance and trying to pull me back into her rhythm. She said, "Honey," she said she was exhausted, she said she already missed me, and I let her speak until she paused, waiting for my usual reassurance. Then I said the only line that mattered, the line that cut straight through her performance without raising my voice, and I said I saw how she was missing me with him. I did not name Grant in that moment, because naming gives people room to debate, and I did not want debate. I wanted impact. There was silence on the line, a long silence where I could almost hear her mind sprinting. Then she laughed weakly, like she could turn it into a joke, and asked what I was talking about. I could have sent her the screenshot, could have shoved the proof into her face immediately, but that would have given her something to fight, something to call fake, something to claim was edited, and I did not want her fighting me. I wanted her fighting emptiness. So I blocked her. I blocked her like a man closing a door, not slamming it, not making a show, just shutting it firmly and turning the lock. Then I sat there in my kitchen with a calm I did not recognize, because I had never blocked my wife in my life, and yet it felt like the most natural step I could take. Blocking was not a punishment. Not really. Blocking was a decision to stop being part of her performance. The next hour was a flood. Notifications from unknown numbers, messages from her friends, from people who never cared about our marriage until it became a spectacle. Calls from numbers I did not recognize, likely hotel lines, likely borrowed phones, likely desperate attempts to regain access to me. I did not answer. I did not reply. I took screenshots where needed, not because I wanted to play games, but because I knew what was coming next. A person like Raina does not accept being cut off. A person like Raina treats silence as an attack, and attacks demand retaliation. By nightfall, I received one message from an account I had not blocked yet, a neutral channel she probably forgot existed, and it contained only a few words that made my stomach tighten. She said she was coming home. She said we needed to talk. She said I was making a huge mistake. The punctuation was sharp, aggressive, and that told me her panic had turned into anger, because anger is what people use when fear makes them feel small. I stared at that message, then looked around my empty house, and I felt the air change again, because now the distance that had protected her was collapsing, and she was rushing back into my space like a storm trying to reclaim the sky. I did not know yet what she planned to do when she arrived, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. She was not coming home to tell the truth. Raina's first move when she loses control is always speed, because speed makes people confuse motion with power, and she has spent her life making the world believe she is powerful. She did not wait a day, did not cool down, did not accept that she might need to explain herself like an adult. She rushed home because she could feel the story slipping out of her hands, and she needed to get back into the room where she could shape it directly. That urgency told me the proof mattered more than her pride, and that is how you know a liar is truly afraid. Pride is easy to maintain when the truth is vague. Pride dies quickly when the truth has a timestamp. I checked my front door camera that faced my own doorway, not because I needed it to catch her with him, but because it would confirm exactly when she returned, and time is the first ingredient in any record that cannot be argued away. I did not need to spy. I only needed to document what happened at my own home, in my own space, with my own devices, because that is lawful, clean, and hard to distort later. Then I did something else that surprised even me. I packed a small overnight bag, not like a man fleeing, but like a man removing himself from a predictable scene. If I stayed home and waited for her, she would arrive to a familiar target, the husband sitting on the couch, ready to be manipulated by tears or rage. She would push for a private argument, because private arguments are where she can rewrite the narrative in real time, where she can accuse me of tone, of paranoia, of being controlling, until I'm defending my personality instead of her choices. I wasn't going to give her that stage. The quickest way to break someone who depends on control is to refuse to play the role they prepared for you. I left my own house before she arrived. I drove to my sister Mara's place on the other side of town, not because I needed comfort, but because I needed a witness to my stability, a person who could later confirm I did not rage, did not threaten, did not behave like the villain Raina would try to paint me as. Mara opened the door, saw my face, and did not ask questions in the hallway like a gossip. She stepped back and let me in, then handed me a glass of water like I was someone who needed to breathe before speaking. That simple kindness almost cracked me, because it reminded me what normal looks like, and normal is always the first casualty when you live with a person who treats life like a negotiation. I told Mara the basics, not a dramatic speech, just the facts, the call, the background music, the merchant alert, the tagged story, Grant's face, the lie, the block. Mara listened without interrupting, then asked one question that mattered, the kind of question only practical people ask. She asked if I saved everything. I told her yes, and she nodded like that was the only acceptable answer. Then she told me to stay calm, because Raina would try to force a reaction, and reactions are what make liars look like victims. I almost laughed at the simplicity of it, because Mara's advice was the same method I had already chosen, and hearing it out loud made me feel less alone in my own head. While we sat in her kitchen, my phone continued to buzz with attempts to reach me. Some messages were pleading, some were angry, some were filled with fake concern about my mental state, and each one sounded like it came from the same template. That repetition confirmed what I had suspected from the beginning. Raina did not just lie, she coordinated. She used her friend circle like a small PR team, sending them to soften me, shame me, pressure me into responding. It was pathetic in a way that would have been funny if it hadn't been my life. Then, at around midnight, the doorbell camera notification came through. My phone showed my own front porch, and there she was, suitcase in hand, hair still styled, makeup intact, standing under my porch light like she owned the space. She looked around, then tried the handle, then stepped back and stared at the door as if it had betrayed her. She knocked. She knocked again, harder. Then she pulled out her phone and started typing furiously, and when she realized she was blocked, she slammed her fist against the door in frustration, not fear, because this was not a woman rushing home to fix a marriage. This was a woman rushing home to regain access to the man she assumed would always be available. I watched the clip twice, then saved a still frame with the timestamp visible, because the exact moment she arrived mattered for what came next. Raina stayed on the porch for 10 minutes, calling, texting, knocking, and then she sat on the front step like she wanted the camera to see her suffering. She was performing again, but this time the audience was not a husband. This time, the audience was a device that did not care about her tears. She eventually left, and the way she left told me something else. She did not walk away slowly like a defeated person. She walked away fast, sharp, angry. She was going somewhere else to regroup, somewhere she could be heard, somewhere she could build a new narrative before morning. A person who is truly sorry goes quiet when they are caught. A person who is afraid of consequences goes loud. The next day, the social pressure began. Mutual contacts started watching my stories more than usual, like they were checking whether I had posted something they needed to counter. Someone from Raina's friend circle posted a vague message about men being insecure and controlling, the kind of post designed to frame the situation before anyone knows the facts. Another person posted about trusting your gut and leaving toxic people, and I could almost see Raina dictating the captions like a director choosing wardrobe. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so predictable. Mara asked me what I planned to do next, and I told her the truth. I said I was going to build a simple timeline, a plain list of dates, locations, and payments, because a liar can fight feelings forever, but a liar cannot fight a table for long without looking ridiculous. I said I would not blast her publicly because public blasting turns into a messy circus and gives her room to claim abuse. I said I would keep everything lawful and clean because clean proof is what destroys people who depend on chaos. That afternoon, I drove back to my house, not to meet her, but to retrieve my printed documents and my calm. I walked inside, felt the air of the home hit me, and noticed that someone had been there. A throw pillow was moved. A cabinet door was slightly open, the kind of small signs that tell you a person entered your space and wanted you to notice. Raina had probably used her spare key, walked through the house, and touched things like she was marking territory. I did not panic. I took a photo of the doorbell log, then walked to my desk and opened a notebook. I wrote the first line of the timeline in ink because ink forces commitment. Day 1. Trip call, claimed hotel, background music, male laugh. Day 1. Merchant alert from waterfront lounge. Day 2. Public story tag, Raina beside Grant at the same venue. Those facts alone were enough to break her cover story, but I knew she would not surrender on basic proof. She would shift stories, add details, accuse me of misunderstanding, so I needed a second layer that made her shifting visible. I checked our shared calendar, not digging into her private accounts, only looking at what we had already agreed to share, and I found the conflict header that made me pause. Raina had marked the trip as work-related, but she had also left a small reminder for herself earlier in the week, a short entry that she likely forgot I could see, and it overlapped with the time she claimed she was asleep. The entry was vague, something like quick meeting, but the time and location didn't match her claimed schedule. I took a screenshot of the header, then exported the week view into a PDF, because PDFs print cleanly and look official without needing a lawyer to bless them. Then my phone buzzed with a new message from a number I did not recognize, and when I opened it, I saw a long paragraph that tried to sound reasonable while sliding a knife under the words. The message said Raina was upset, that she felt unsafe, that she was worried about how I might react, and that she wanted me to meet her in a public place to talk. That phrasing was not random. That phrasing was a foundation. Unsafe is not a feeling in those messages. It is a strategic word that creates a future excuse. If I refused to meet, I was cold. If I agreed, she could claim I threatened her. If I got angry, she could claim she was right. It was a trap disguised as concern. I did not respond. I saved the message. Then I wrote another note in my ledger. Narrative seeding begins. Likely abuse frame attempt. I hated that I had to think like this about my marriage, but marriage with Raina had become a game of image. An image is always a battlefield. In the evening, she showed up again, this time not on the porch like a confused traveler, but in the driveway like a woman arriving to win. She stood outside my door and called out my name, loud enough for neighbors to hear, because neighbors are always useful witnesses when you want to frame yourself as abandoned. I stayed inside, quiet, watching through the peephole without moving, because the moment I opened that door, she would have her stage back. She left a small gift at the doorstep, a bag of my favorite pastries from a bakery she knew I liked, because manipulation always wears the mask of care. I waited until she drove away. Then I picked up the bag, took a photo of it with the time visible on my phone screen, and threw the pastries into the trash without opening them. That might sound cruel, but it wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. You don't eat comfort from the person who just lied with confidence. The next morning, I received a call from a mutual acquaintance at Raina's workplace, someone I barely knew, and his voice sounded strained, like he was calling because he had been asked to. He said he heard there was trouble, and he wanted to make sure everything was okay. I asked him what exactly he heard, and he hesitated before answering, because hesitation is the sound of someone choosing whether to repeat a lie. He said he heard I was being unreasonable, that I blocked Raina without explanation, and that she was devastated because she loved me. The words were almost comical in their simplicity, because they positioned her as the loyal wife and me as the unstable husband, and I could see the story forming like wet cement, ready to harden if nobody challenged it. I thanked him for checking in, spoke calmly, and ended the call without sharing details. Then I updated my ledger again, workplace optics being prepared. If she was pushing the narrative into her workplace, it meant she was afraid of something bigger than a divorce conversation. It meant she was afraid of consequences that touched her image, her career, her social shield. That fear told me where the real pressure point was. I sat at my desk and stared at the screenshots, the calendar PDF, the merchant alert, the doorbell still frame, the public tag, and the message using the word unsafe. It was all there, a small stack of ordinary proof that did not require hacking or spying or tricks, just attention. I realized Raina had made one fatal mistake, the kind people make when they believe they are smarter than everyone else. She assumed I would react like a wounded husband instead of a careful man. I opened a new document and began formatting the timeline into a one-page table. Dates on the left, claimed story in the middle, proof on the right, because when you lay it out, that simply, nobody can hide behind confusion. I kept it short, I kept it clean, and as I worked, I felt something else rise. Not rage, not vengeance, but a cold sense of direction. The feeling of stepping onto a road you cannot unwalk. Because Raina rushed home thinking she could talk her way back into control, and she did not understand that I was not planning to argue with her. I was planning to let the truth become a record, and once the truth becomes a record, it stops caring how charming you are. And somewhere in the middle of that clean, quiet work, my phone buzzed again with a new notification, a new piece of timing, and I understood the next move she was about to make before she made it. She wasn't just rushing home to talk, she was rushing home to build a story that could survive what I was about to print. By the third day, I could feel the shape of her counterattack forming, because Raina never fought with facts first. She fought with perception, and perception is easier to move when people are tired, confused, and hungry for a simple villain. The first sign came through the neighborhood before it came through her, because neighborhoods are small ecosystems that live on quiet observation and loud interpretation. I walked out to take the trash to the curb and noticed two of our neighbors pause their conversation as I approached, not in a casual way, but in the way people pause when they are already discussing you and need to decide whether you are safe to look at directly. One of them gave me a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes, the kind of smile that says you are either a victim or a threat, and the worst part is she hadn't decided which one yet. Inside, my phone continued to hum with attempts to reach me through every channel that still existed. Some messages were from unknown numbers, some from friends of friends, and some from people who had never spoken to me outside of polite holidays, suddenly claiming concern like it was their hobby. Each message carried the same soft framing, the same language that tried to sound reasonable while bending the world toward Raina's version of events. They told me she was worried about me, that she was confused, that she was scared, that she only wanted to talk. And every time I saw the word scared, my jaw tightened, because fear was not what she had shown on my porch. Anger was what she had shown. Control was what she had tried to reclaim. I sat at my desk and placed my phone face down because I did not want my concentration interrupted by people who thought they could pressure me into playing the role they assigned. I needed my mind clear, and clarity always comes from organizing chaos into something plain. I opened my timeline file and refined it, not adding drama, not adding guesses, only adding what I could prove without bending any law or stepping into any gray space. I logged the trip call, the merchant alert, the tagged story, the doorbell still frame, the calendar header. I added one new column labeled Her Claim, because the difference between a lie and a collapse is the moment you force the liar to commit to a specific claim. A liar can float in vagueness forever, but once they say a date, a time, and a place, the truth has handles. My doorbell camera pinged again that afternoon. Raina returned, not alone this time. She arrived with Lila Voss, her closest friend, the one who always positioned herself like a protector while quietly feeding on other people's crises. Lila carried a tote bag and a concerned expression, and I could already predict her approach. The friend who speaks softly, tells you she understands, and then lays down the script as if it's kindness. They stood on my porch together, Raina slightly behind Lila like she was letting her friend do the first push. The staging was deliberate. If I opened the door, it would look like I was confronted by two reasonable women and refused to listen. If I stayed silent, it would look like I was punishing them. Either way, the optics served them. I watched through the camera feed without moving. Raina knocked, then stepped back and looked toward the street as if she wanted anyone passing by to see her posture of patient suffering. Lila leaned toward the camera and spoke, her lips moving in slow, careful phrases. I couldn't hear her through the doorbell stills, but I didn't need to. I could read the shape of her words. She was asking me to talk. She was reassuring me. She was implying I was spiraling, and she was offering herself as the calm mediator. Raina stood with her arms folded, face tight, and that detail mattered because it told me the performance of softness was already exhausting her. They waited, then left, and minutes later, I received a text from Lila on a channel she still had access to. She said she was worried about me. She said Raina was devastated. She said this misunderstanding was getting out of hand, and she said I should meet them somewhere public to clear the air. The message contained the same word again, unsafe. It was placed neatly in the middle, like a seed. I took a screenshot. Then I opened my notebook and wrote one line, underlined twice. They are building an abuse frame. I never wanted to believe that about my own wife, but I had seen enough people weaponize language to know when a story was being prepared. You don't mention safety to a calm, silent man unless you want someone else to believe he is dangerous. You don't push for a public meeting unless you want witnesses to your version of the truth. This wasn't about fixing anything. This was about establishing a narrative that could survive when my timeline became visible. I called my sister Mara and told her what I saw. Mara didn't waste time on sympathy noises. She told me to avoid any situation where Raina could record partial audio or provoke a reaction. She told me to keep everything in writing when possible. She told me to prepare for the possibility that Raina would claim she returned home and found me unstable, because that story would play well in the mouths of people who love drama. Then Mara told me to do something simple that made my throat tighten, because it reminded me of how serious things had become. She told me to write down my own account of the timeline on paper, sign it, and date it. Not because I expected a courtroom that week, but because in conflicts like this, The person who prepares early always wins later. The person who waits for things to calm down is the person who gets buried by the calm liar's story. So I wrote my own short statement, factual and plain, and I signed it. I took a photo of it next to the day's newspaper, not because the newspaper mattered, but because the visible date anchored the moment in a way that is harder to dispute. I placed the paper into a clear sleeve and labeled it with the day. It felt absurd, like I was cataloging a crime scene in my own home, but it also felt stabilizing, because my life had been pulled into a zone where stability only exists when you build it yourself. That evening, I received another call, this time from a co-worker I trusted more than Raina's orbit, a man named Ethan Cole, who worked in the same broader company ecosystem, not on her team, but close enough to hear the buzzing edges of rumors. Ethan spoke quietly, like he didn't want his words carried by walls. He said he wanted to check in because people were talking, and he didn't like the way the story was being framed. That alone told me Ethan wasn't calling on Raina's orders. He was calling because he smelled manipulation and didn't want to be used as a background extra. I thanked him and asked what exactly was being said. Ethan hesitated, then told me that Raina had mentioned marriage issues in a vague way and implied I was reacting badly. He didn't say she claimed I was violent. He didn't say she accused me directly. He said she was planting hints. That was more dangerous, because hints allow people's imaginations to do the work, and imaginations are always crueler than facts. I told Ethan I wasn't asking him to take sides, and I meant it. Then I asked him one question that mattered. Had he noticed anything about Grant Hale lately? Ethan paused again, and in that pause I heard confirmation before he spoke. He told me Grant had been around more than usual at company-adjacent events, and he told me Grant seemed unusually confident for a vendor. Ethan said it felt like Grant was acting like someone protected by an internal connection. That detail hit me like a cold drop of water. Vendors are only bold when someone inside invites boldness. After the call, I updated my timeline again, adding a note about workplace optics and vendor presence. I did not add guesses. I just added what Ethan told me. Then I stared at the page and realized my story was no longer just about my marriage. If Grant was leaning into internal protection, and if Raina was pushing a safety narrative at work, then the battlefield would inevitably shift into professional territory, because professional territory is where narratives become policy and consequences become procedural. That night, Raina tried a new tactic. She sent me an email to the shared household inbox, the kind of email you use when you want to look reasonable on record. The subject line was calm and bland, something like, "Please respond," and the body was a carefully written paragraph that described her love, her confusion, her concern, and her request to talk. It also contained another subtle hint that she felt unsafe and didn't know what I might do next. That phrase landed like a dart. I saved the email headers. I printed the email. Then I wrote one sentence on my ledger. She is building a paper trail against me. The next morning, I did something that felt ugly but necessary. I called the front desk of the waterfront lounge, not to ask about Raina, not to demand surveillance footage, not to attempt any miracle proof, because that would violate my own rules and invite disaster. I asked only for one thing: whether the merchant name on my alert was accurate, and whether it was a lounge with table service. The person on the phone confirmed it was. They offered no details beyond what anyone could know. I thanked them and ended the call. I wasn't gathering private information. I was confirming that my own payment record wasn't mislabeled. That small confirmation tightened the timeline into a clean line. Raina could still claim misunderstanding, but misunderstanding becomes harder when every element aligns. Her call, the music, the charge, the tagged story, the doorbell arrival, the calendar conflict, the rehearsed friend messaging, the safety hints. It was too much for coincidence, and that mattered because my goal wasn't to convince myself. My goal was to prepare a structure that would hold under pressure. In the afternoon, I received one more message, and it was the kind that makes you feel the walls closing in. It was from someone in the neighborhood group chat, a woman who usually posted about lost packages and noisy cars. She wrote a vague message about respecting women's safety and believing victims. She did not name Raina, but she did tag the post with a general comment about, "Sometimes husbands become dangerous when confronted." It was the kind of post that asks for solidarity while quietly accusing someone of a crime they haven't committed. I stared at that message until I felt my hands turn cold. Raina's story was spreading outward, not as truth, but as implication. I took a screenshot because it mattered as evidence of the narrative she was trying to seed. Then I did the only thing that made sense. I refused to fight her story with my own story. Stories argue, documents resolve. That night, I sat at my desk and refined the one-page table again. I added a final column titled Verification Type, and under each proof I wrote what it was: public tag, bank alert, calendar header, doorbell timestamp, email header, witness phrasing. My table was becoming a weapon, not because it was dramatic, but because it was boring. Nothing terrifies a liar like boredom, because boredom has no emotional hooks to manipulate. As I finished, my phone buzzed once more, and the screen displayed a voicemail notification from an unknown number. I opened it and listened, and I heard Raina's voice, not sweet this time, but sharp, controlled, and angry. She said I was humiliating her. She said I was making her look bad. She said she would not let me destroy her life because I was insecure. The funniest part was that she never said she hadn't done it. She never said Grant didn't exist. She only attacked my reaction, because attacking the reaction is what liars do when they cannot deny the facts. I saved the voicemail timestamp. Then I sat back and felt something settle into place inside me, because her anger was the clearest proof of all. A woman rushing home for love doesn't leave a voicemail like that. A woman rushing home to regain control does. And now I knew what she would do next, because the narrative she was seeding was reaching for a bigger stage. She was going to drag this into my workplace before I could drag it into hers. The day the rumor reaches your work is the day your life stops being yours, because work is where adults pretend to be rational while quietly acting like high school students with better clothes. I walked into my office with my posture steady, my face neutral, and my mind already prepared, because I knew Raina would not limit her damage to my feelings. If she could injure my reputation, she would, not because she hated me, but because she needed a distraction. A wounded husband looks irrational. A wife who looks like a victim looks protected. That simple equation has saved liars for decades. My job quietly involves compliance, not in the dramatic sense, but in the boring sense of reading policies, documenting incidents, and noticing patterns others ignore. It means I am trained to treat facts like objects, not feelings, and it means I understand something many people forget. Institutions don't care about love, they care about risk. Raina didn't understand that. She thought institutions were crowds you could charm. In reality, institutions are machines, and machines run on documentation. I kept my day normal at first. I answered emails. I handled routine checks. I spoke politely in meetings. I let my calm do the work of protecting me from the narrative she was trying to paint. Then, before lunch, I received a meeting invite from HR, short and bland, with no details besides a request to discuss personal conduct concerns. The invite did not name Raina, but my stomach tightened anyway, because I could feel her fingerprints on the timing. I forwarded the invite to my private evidence folder, then printed it and placed it into a sleeve, because the simplest way to protect yourself from narrative traps is to create your own record before someone else creates theirs. Then I walked into the HR office at the scheduled time with my shoulders relaxed and my mind clear. The HR representative was named Kira Dunn, and she had the expression of a person who hates being used as a therapist for other people's marriages. Kira didn't smile too much, didn't lean into empathy, and didn't ask emotional questions. She asked factual ones. She asked whether there was a domestic dispute likely to spill into the workplace. She asked whether I expected harassment or escalation. She asked whether there were any safety concerns. She asked the questions in a way that made it clear she had been prompted, because HR questions always follow a script, and scripts are usually triggered by someone's complaint. I answered carefully and honestly. I said there was no workplace disruption from me. I said I had not threatened anyone. I said I had not contacted my wife at work and had not approached any co-workers about my marriage. I said I was aware rumors might spread, and I was prepared to keep my behavior professional. Kira listened, then asked if I had any documentation relevant to the claims being hinted at. The word hinted mattered. It meant she wasn't holding an official allegation yet. It meant she was in the early stage where someone is trying to plant a story. I told Kira I would provide documents if needed, but I wanted clarity on what was being suggested. Kira did not give me the details, likely because she was trying to keep HR neutral. But she did say one thing that confirmed my worst suspicion. She said someone had indicated I might react unpredictably and that she needed to ensure the workplace remained safe. There it was again. Safe. Raina's favorite seed. I kept my face still and said I understood. I said I appreciated HR's caution. Then I asked Kira if the company had a policy regarding false allegations and whether there were consequences for using workplace channels to frame personal disputes. Kira's eyes flicked up slightly, not in anger, but in interest, the interest of a professional hearing a question that implies the person across from them is not panicking. She told me there were policies about misuse of reporting channels, but she didn't lecture. She simply noted my question. Then she asked, gently but directly, if I had any evidence that could clarify the situation if it escalated. I could have unloaded everything then, but dumping a pile of proof too early can look like obsession, and Raina would use that. So I gave Kira one clean piece, something that was undeniably public and tied to timing, without adding my own emotional commentary. I showed her the screenshot of the public story tag with the date stamp visible, and I showed her the merchant alert with the time and location that matched. I did not say, she cheated, like a scorned husband. I said, these two items conflict with the travel account being presented. Kira looked at the screenshots quietly, then nodded once, slow and professional. She did not judge. She did not gasp. She did not ask for details about my marriage. She only asked if I could provide a simple timeline in a printable format if the reporting channel was used again. That request was a gift, because it told me my method was aligned with the machine. Machines want tables. I told her I had a one-page timeline already, and Kira said that if I submitted anything, I should keep it factual, keep it concise, and avoid speculation. I almost smiled, because speculation had never been my strategy. Then she ended the meeting and told me she would document our discussion as a precaution. As I left, I saw her typing, and I understood something important. The moment HR types, the story begins to harden into record. Raina's seed had made it into the machine. The question was which version of the story the machine would accept. I returned to my desk, sat down, and stared at the timeline file on my screen. I made it cleaner. I shortened sentences. I removed any adjectives. I removed anything that sounded like emotion. I replaced "she lied" with "she stated X," and I replaced "I saw her with him" with "public story shows proximity to Grant Hale." I kept my language sterile, because sterile language survives policy review. Emotional language gets dismissed as drama. Later that afternoon, Ethan Cole stopped by my desk, pretending he needed a file from me. He lowered his voice and told me that Raina had been asking around, not directly about me, but about how HR handles spouses who react badly. Ethan's eyes held quiet disgust as he said it, and I felt a cold anger rise in me, not because she was leaving, not because she was cheating, but because she was trying to injure me on her way down. I thanked Ethan and asked him one more question. Had anyone else used the same phrasing? Ethan frowned and said yes, that Lila had said almost the same line in the break area earlier, and that it sounded rehearsed. That detail was a spark. If the same phrase was being repeated by different mouths, then the narrative wasn't organic. It was coordinated. When I got home that evening, I opened my evidence ledger and did something that felt oddly satisfying. I placed 2 messages side by side on the screen, one from Lila and one from a mutual contact, and I highlighted the repeated phrasing with a marker on a printed copy. It was the same structure, the same gentle tone, the same seeded words. I wasn't reading messages anymore. I was reading a script. That was the moment I understood the mid-level twist hiding inside the chaos. Raina's friends weren't just supporting her. They were distributing her alibi and her frame like a product. And if they were distributing it, then someone was likely coordinating it, and that coordinator could be pressured, because coordinators panic when their script becomes visible. I slept poorly that night, not from fear, but from mental load, because building a clean record while your life is being dirtied by implication is exhausting in a way that sleep doesn't fix. Early in the morning, my phone buzzed with an update from the bank app again, another merchant notification, smaller this time, almost trivial, but tied to a location that made my throat tighten. It was a coffee shop near the same waterfront district, charged the day after her tired hotel night, and that detail mattered because it suggested a pattern. It suggested she wasn't just there once. It suggested she returned. I didn't need to accuse her to use it. I only needed to log it. I added the new charge to the timeline as a secondary item, not the main proof, but a reinforcement. Then, I printed the updated 1-page table and signed the back again, because each update needed its own anchor. I placed the paper into a sleeve and labeled it with the day. My evidence wasn't growing dramatic, it was growing stable. In the afternoon, Raina showed up at my house again, this time alone, and this time she didn't knock politely. She pounded, she shouted my name, she demanded I let her in. The noise was loud enough to attract attention, and she wanted that, because attention is the oxygen of her strategy. I remained inside, silent, and watched her through the peephole as she paced, glared, and then suddenly shifted her expression into something softer when she saw a neighbor glance over. The switch was immediate, like a light flicking on. She waved at the neighbor, smiled, and then returned to anger the moment the neighbor looked away. I recorded nothing that wasn't mine to record. I only saved a doorbell still frame with the timestamp, because it showed her arrival and behavior at my door, and it would matter later if she claimed I refused to let her retrieve necessities or forced her into distress. I wasn't trying to harm her. I was trying to protect myself from her story. After she left, my phone buzzed with one more message from an unknown number, and this one didn't try to sound kind. It warned me to stop humiliating Raina. It told me I would regret pushing her. It implied consequences. I stared at it, then saved it, because threats are useful when they come from people who think they are invisible. I sat down at my desk again and reread Kira's words in my head. Keep it factual. Keep it concise. Avoid speculation. Then I looked at my 1-page timeline, and I realized the next move wasn't a private confrontation, and it wasn't a social media war. The next move was forcing this into a public institutional space where she couldn't talk over the record. And as I reached for my phone to schedule the next step, I saw a new notification from a public account I hadn't checked in days, and my stomach dropped, because it showed Raina posting a smiling selfie with a caption about healing, safety, and fresh starts. She was sprinting ahead of the truth, trying to claim the finish line first. So I smiled, quietly, alone in my kitchen, and updated my timeline one last time before the real pressure began. Because the faster she ran, the harder her fall would look when the record finally caught her. I agreed to meet her at the airport for one reason, and it had nothing to do with love, forgiveness, or the fantasy that a public place turns liars into honest people. I agreed because Raina and her friends had already started planting that soft little word, unsafe, in every sentence they could squeeze it into, and I knew how that seed grows if you give it time, because time turns hints into everyone knows, and everyone knows becomes the only evidence some people ever need. If she wanted a public meeting, fine. I would give her public, but I would give it on my terms, in a space where cameras existed for security and not for miracles, where I did not have to request footage, where I did not have to chase anything, because my goal was never to trap her with technology. My goal was to trap her with her own mouth, the same mouth that had called me honey while she leaned into him under bright lights. She messaged me through the shared household inbox again, using that careful professional tone that tries to sound reasonable while hiding a knife behind the grammar. And she said she had a flight change. She said she was exhausted. She said she just wanted 5 minutes to clear everything up, and she said she would feel safer if we met somewhere with people around. I read the email twice and smiled once, because the more she insisted on safety, the more obvious it became that her real fear was exposure, not my temper. I did not reply with emotion. I replied with logistics, because logistics are hard to twist without looking ridiculous. I told her I would be at the airport arrivals corridor at a specific time. I told her I would not leave my car unattended for long, and I told her I would not discuss anything beyond one simple question. That final detail mattered because people like Raina don't fear arguments, they thrive on them, but they panic when you reduce their theater to one date, one time, one place. I arrived early, parked, and walked into the terminal with the calm of a man going to pick up a stranger, not the wife who had been my life. The air inside had that familiar airport smell, coffee mixed with antiseptic cleaner and tired perfume, and the sound of rolling suitcases was constant, like a dull drum that never stops. People moved in clusters, scanning the crowd, clutching paper cups, adjusting jackets, living their small dramas in a place built for departures. I stood near a pillar by the arrivals doors and watched the flow without fidgeting, because fidgeting makes you look guilty, and I was done letting her frame me as anything other than what I was, a man who had facts and no interest in violence. I checked the time once, then put my phone away, because if I stared at a screen, I would miss the small human signals that always reveal more than any device. I saw a couple arguing quietly near the baggage carousel. I saw a teenager crying into her hoodie while her mother rubbed her back. I saw a businessman rehearse a smile before walking toward a waiting woman, and all of it reminded me that airports don't judge, they just witness. That was what I wanted, not sympathy from strangers, just witnesses existing in the same space where my wife planned to stage her version of reality. When the arrivals doors slid open, the crowd shifted, and then I saw her. Raina came through like she expected the building to part for her, hair still styled, coat fitted, sunglasses perched on her head, even though the lighting was fluorescent and unforgiving. She wheeled her suitcase with one hand and held her phone in the other, already scanning, already calculating. Behind her, half a step back, was Lila, because of course Lila was there, the loyal friend with the tote bag and the concerned face, the mediator who always manages to be present when she's useful to the story. They approached together, and I saw Raina's expression harden the moment she noticed I was not moving toward her with open arms. She expected me to be the man waiting to be managed. Instead, I stayed by the pillar like I was waiting for a taxi. She walked closer, stopped 3 feet from me, and her face did something quick and practiced, a flash of softness, the version of her that tries to pull you back into the old world. Then she looked around, noticed people nearby, and held that softness for the audience. Lila stepped in slightly, angled her body as if she needed to shield Raina from me, and I understood immediately what they wanted. They wanted a scene where I looked cold and they looked fragile, because fragility in public becomes protection later. I did not greet her. I did not ask how the flight was. I did not offer to take her suitcase. Those gestures belonged to a marriage. We were in something else now, something procedural, and procedures do not hold luggage. I asked my one question, exactly the way I planned to ask it, the way a man asks a simple question when he already knows the answer and wants the liar to commit anyway. I asked her to tell me where she was at the time of the waterfront lounge charge on my account, and I asked it in the calmest voice I've ever used, because calm is a weapon when someone is trying to provoke you. Raina blinked once, like she was surprised by the bluntness, and then she smiled, because smiling is her default defense. She began talking fast, too fast, filling the air with explanations that sounded almost plausible if you didn't have a timeline. She said she was tired. She said the hotel had issues. She said she had to meet someone about a booking problem. She said she only stepped out for a minute, and she said she didn't realize the shared account was used. Lila nodded along, like she had been trained to validate each line with her face. The performance was smooth, but speed always creates seams, and I watched for them. I didn't interrupt. I let her talk until she reached the part of her story where she had to choose a specific time, and that was where the first crack appeared, because her mouth hesitated for half a second, the kind of hesitation that sounds tiny but feels loud when you are listening for it. She gave me a time that was 10 minutes earlier than the merchant alert, and in that small misalignment, I felt my own clarity sharpen, because lies are rarely wrong in big ways. They are wrong in small ways that can't be fixed without changing everything around them. I asked her again, slower, to confirm the time, and I watched her eyes flick to Lila. That glance was not love or comfort. That glance was a quick check with a partner in performance. Lila answered with her expression first, then leaned in slightly, and Raina corrected the time. But the correction wasn't clean. She corrected it by adding a new detail, a new reason, a new excuse, because that is how liars patch holes. They don't repair, they pile. I nodded once like I was acknowledging her effort, and then I asked the second question I allowed myself, because I needed her to collide with her own public record. I asked her if she wanted to explain why she appeared in a public story tag at the same venue, smiling beside Grant Hale, on the same night she claimed she was asleep. I said his name evenly, not as an insult, just as a fact. The moment I said it, Raina's face tightened, because naming the lover is the moment the lie becomes a shape everyone can see. Lila's eyes widened in a practiced way, like she wanted onlookers to register shock, and Raina's mouth opened, then closed, because she had not planned to be forced into that corner in front of strangers. She tried to laugh again, tried to make it sound like a misunderstanding, tried to imply the video was old, or edited, or taken out of context. But those defenses are weak when the tag contains a date stamp and the merchant alert contains a time. Weak defenses make liars angry, and I watched anger rise behind her eyes like a dark tide. She told me I was humiliating her. She told me I was stalking her. She told me I was acting unstable. She said the word unsafe again, louder this time, not as a hint, but as a statement meant for the crowd. The word landed in the open air, and I saw a couple nearby glance over, their faces tightening with that reflexive discomfort people have when they smell domestic conflict. Raina noticed their attention and leaned into it, because attention is what she came for. That was the moment I made my second decision, the decision that turned the airport corridor into a trap for her instead of for me. I did not defend myself. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not raise my voice. I did not do anything that would give her a clip to carry back into her workplace or her friend circle like a trophy. I simply ended the interaction with my body. I stepped back one pace, then another, and I turned slightly as if I was leaving, because leaving is the one move that destroys a person who lives on control. Raina's expression shifted from righteous anger into sudden panic, because panic is what happens when your target refuses to stay on stage. She reached toward me, not touching, but reaching, and her voice rose again, louder, sharper, trying to pull me back into the scene. I kept walking. I walked past the coffee kiosk, where the barista stared at us like she wanted to pretend she didn't see anything. I walked past the line of tired travelers. I walked toward the exit without running, because running looks guilty, and I was not going to look guilty in my own life anymore. Behind me, I heard Raina's suitcase wheels scrape, heard Lila's hurried steps, heard the hiss of their whispers as they tried to adjust the plan in real time. Outside, the cold air hit my face like a clean slap, and I felt my pulse settle, because the hardest part of resisting manipulation is not the words. It's the urge to explain yourself. Explaining yourself to a liar is like pouring water into a cracked cup. You keep giving, and the crack only widens. I reached my car and got inside, and the moment I shut the door, my phone began to buzz, because Raina had moved from performance to desperation. New numbers lit up my screen, then another like a swarm. I ignored them. Then I received a voicemail notification from an unknown number, and something in me told me to save it, not for emotional reasons, but for timing, because a person's first panicked voicemail after being refused contains more truth than their best rehearsed speech. I listened once. Her voice was furious, but beneath the fury was fear, and fear always sharpens the edges of truth. She accused me of ruining her life, accused me of making her look bad, accused me of being insecure. And then, in the middle of the rant, she let a detail slip. The kind of detail you only slip when your brain is racing faster than your mouth. She referenced that night, as if we both knew which night she meant, as if the event was real and shared and undeniable. It wasn't a denial. It was a complaint about consequences. That difference mattered more than any confession. I saved the voicemail timestamp and added it to my ledger as a new anchor point, because it showed escalation after public refusal, and it showed her language shifting from apology scripts into raw frustration. Then I drove away from the airport without looking back, because I didn't need to see them standing there, their plan failing in real time. I could feel it. By the time I got home, my porch light was on and there was a paper taped to my door, a note written in careful handwriting that tried to look calm. It said she needed to retrieve some personal items. It said she was worried about me. It said she would bring a friend for safety, and it asked me to respond. The note was a prop, something she could photograph later to show she tried. I took a photo of it with the timestamp on my phone screen visible, then peeled it off and placed it into a sleeve, because even props become evidence when you document them correctly. That night, as I lay in bed, the house felt less like a home and more like a courtroom waiting for a judge. I stared at the ceiling, hearing the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of cars, and I realized something that would have sounded insane a week ago, but felt obvious now. Blocking her was never the revenge. Blocking her was me stepping out of the part where my life was negotiable. And now, she was going to push harder, because people who depend on access always do. The first clue that her story was scripted came from the exact place scripts always leak, not in the big dramatic moments, but in the small repetitive phrases people use when they are reciting instead of speaking. It started with Lila's texts, then it appeared in the neighborhood group posts, then it echoed in the soft concern messages from mutual acquaintances, and by the time it reached my workplace, I could hear the same structure moving through different mouths like a virus. At first it sounded like coincidence because coincidences happen, but coincidences don't reuse the same weird rhythm, and they don't reuse the same two key words in the same position. This wasn't organic worry. This was coordinated messaging. I sat at my desk early the next morning with coffee I couldn't taste and pulled up every message that used the word unsafe, every message that described my silence as unpredictable, every message that hinted at fear without naming an actual act. I wasn't doing this out of obsession. I was doing it the way you examine a pattern when you suspect fraud, because a fraudster always repeats what works, and repetition becomes their fingerprint. I printed 2 messages first, one from Lila and one from a mutual friend I barely knew, and I placed them on the table side by side. I read them aloud to myself, not for drama, but for rhythm, because rhythm is where scripts hide. There it was, the same phrase structure, The same gentle opening, the same pivot into safety, the same suggestion of public meeting, the same final line about how worried they were about what I might do. If you change the names, the messages become identical in spirit, and spirit is what a coordinated group aims for, because spirit is harder to dispute than facts. I highlighted the repeated phrases with a marker and felt something in my chest tighten, not from sadness, but from disgust, because it meant Raina wasn't just lying to protect herself, she was recruiting people to weaponize language against me. Cheating was betrayal, but this was something colder. This was an attempt to pre-frame me as dangerous, so her own behavior would look like a reasonable response. That kind of framing is not the act of a woman who is sorry. It is the act of a woman preparing for war. I added the comparison to my ledger as a formal step, because I wanted the method to be consistent. Capture, confirm, record, then apply pressure. I took a photo of the 2 printed messages on the table with the highlights visible, and I signed the back of each printout with the date, because if the story ever needed to be defended, I wanted a clean chain of context, not just screenshots floating in a phone gallery like gossip. Then I called Ethan Cole. I didn't call him to vent, because Ethan wasn't my therapist, and I didn't call him to ask him to choose sides, because adults who choose sides too early become liabilities. I called him because Ethan had already shown me he noticed the smell of manipulation, and people who notice patterns are the most valuable witnesses, because they aren't easily swayed by tears. Ethan answered quietly, and I asked him a simple question. Had he heard any of the same phrases repeated at work? Ethan exhaled, and that exhale told me the answer before he spoke. He said yes, and he said it bothered him because it sounded unnatural, like people were quoting something they didn't fully understand. He told me he heard Lila in the break area once talking to a coworker saying Raina was afraid of how I might react, and he told me the sentence sounded almost memorized, like she had practiced it with the same careful cadence. Then Ethan told me something that turned my suspicion into certainty. He told me Raina herself used the same wording almost verbatim in a conversation he overheard, and he said she did it while looking at her phone, like she was reading a prompt and speaking it aloud. That detail hit like a clean slap. People can lie spontaneously, but people read scripts when the lie needs to be consistent across witnesses. I thanked Ethan and ended the call, then stared at my ledger until the lines seemed to sharpen. I wasn't just dealing with a wife who cheated. I was dealing with a coordinated narrative campaign designed to shift consequences away from her and onto me. And in that moment, the story twisted, because the affair itself stopped being the central danger. The central danger became the frame, the attempt to turn me into the villain so her betrayal would look like self-defense. That was the mid-story twist I hadn't expected when I first saw the story tag. The cheating was real, but the real target was my credibility. Once I saw that, my method became even simpler, because the antidote to a narrative campaign is not a counter-narrative. It is documentation that reduces emotion to geometry. I opened my 1-page timeline again and added a small section at the bottom titled Messaging Pattern, and under it I listed the repeated phrases, the dates they arrived, and the senders. I didn't label it manipulation. I labeled it repeated language, because labels invite debate, while descriptions invite agreement. Then I printed the updated timeline and placed it into a sleeve like the others, because consistency is what makes evidence feel real, and inconsistency is what liars use to discredit you. As the day went on, Raina tried again, but her attempts had shifted from sweet to sharp. She emailed the shared inbox, saying she needed to collect belongings. She mentioned safety again. She insisted on bringing Lila. She said she would call a mediator if I refused. The moment she mentioned a mediator, I understood what she was trying to do. She wanted an institutional witness who would see her tears and hear her version first, because first impressions matter, and she wanted to convert a personal dispute into a formal process where she could posture as the reasonable party. I didn't respond. Instead, I prepared for what I knew was coming, the next escalation. her trying to make the workplace itself the arena. I drove to the office, kept my behavior steady, and waited for the next HR move like a man waiting for weather. Around mid-afternoon, Kira Dunn sent a short message asking if I could provide the concise timeline we discussed, because she expected follow-up on the concerns. That request told me Raina had pushed again. She had likely made a more formal complaint, or she had leaned harder into the safety angle. The machine was moving, and the machine wanted documents. I replied that I could provide a one-page timeline with supporting screenshots, and I asked Kira where and how she preferred it delivered, because procedures protect both sides, and I wanted everything done cleanly. Kira responded with a simple instruction to submit it in person in a sealed sleeve so it could be logged. The phrase logged mattered because logged means record, and record means Raina's story would no longer float freely in gossip. It would have to collide with the truth. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table and arranged my proof like an ordinary man arranging ordinary paperwork, because nothing about it was dramatic up close. It was a printed story tag. It was a merchant alert. It was a calendar header. It was a doorbell still frame. It was a voicemail timestamp. It was 2 identical messaging scripts highlighted like a school assignment. All small, all household level, all lawful, all boring. And that boredom was the sharpest edge I had. I placed each item into a clear sleeve, labeled each sleeve with date and short description, and created a simple cover page that listed what was inside. I didn't add commentary. I didn't add insults. I didn't add conclusions. I let the sequence of facts speak, because facts do not need anger to be loud. Late that night, as I was finishing the packet, my phone buzzed again with a new voicemail from another unknown number. I listened once, and Raina's voice was different this time. It wasn't furious. It was softer, almost pleading, but the softness didn't feel like remorse. It felt like strategy adjusted. She said she loved me. She said she didn't want to lose everything. She said she made mistakes. She said she only needed to explain. She didn't deny Grant. She didn't deny the venue. She only begged for the one thing she needed to survive, a private conversation where she could bargain. I saved the voicemail timestamp and added it to the ledger because the shift in tone was proof of panic management, and panic management is what people do when they see the record forming in front of them. Then I sat in silence for a long time, holding my phone like a heavy object, and I realized something else that made my mouth go dry. Raina wasn't panicking because she loved me and feared losing me. She was panicking because she feared losing the life she built on being admired, trusted, and believed. She feared losing her social shield, her workplace standing, her ability to turn a room with a smile. That kind of fear makes people dangerous, not physically dangerous, but socially dangerous, because they will burn anyone if it buys them another day of control. I shut off the lights, walked into my bedroom, and lay down without sleep. My mind kept replaying her airport performance, the way she said unsafe louder when strangers were near, the way she checked Lila's face for cues, the way her story patched itself with new details instead of staying clean. I thought about the identical phrases, the repeated rhythm, the evidence of coordination, and I felt a cold certainty settle deeper, because mid-story twists don't just change what you know, they change what you must do. I was no longer chasing proof of cheating. I was preventing a frame that could stain my name long after she moved on. In the morning, I would hand Kira Dunn a sealed packet, and the moment she logged it, the machine would begin to care about reality more than Raina's performance. But machines are slow, and Raina was fast, and that meant she would try one more thing before the record hardened. She would try to get ahead of the packet by staging a new public scene where she looked hurt and I looked cruel, because if she could win the crowd, she could pressure the machine. As I drifted toward uneasy sleep, my phone buzzed one last time with a notification I hadn't expected, and it pulled me fully awake. A public post had appeared, tagged with a smiling photo, and it was written in the same soft, rehearsed language I had just highlighted on paper. Only this time, it wasn't just her friends spreading the script. It was Raina posting the script herself, for everyone to rehearse with her. By sunrise, her post had already done what she wanted it to do, because it gave everyone permission to repeat her story without feeling like liars. She wrapped the message in soft words about healing, boundaries, and safety, then let the comment section do the dirty work, because crowds love a villain more than they love the truth. I read it once, then twice, and each time I noticed the same rehearsed rhythm I had highlighted on my kitchen table, the same gentle opening, the same pivot into fear, the same implication that my silence meant danger. She did not name me directly, but she did not have to, because the people who knew us would fill in the blank, and the people who did not know us would enjoy filling it in anyway. I did not respond publicly, because public responses are food, and I was done feeding her. Instead, I updated my ledger with a single screenshot of the post, including the timestamp and the visible comments that repeated the same phrase about unpredictability. I saved it in the same folder as everything else, because my method only works if it stays boring, and boring means consistent. Then I put on my jacket and carried my sealed packet to work like it was just another piece of paperwork, because the only way to beat a narrative is to refuse to look like you are fighting it. The office felt different the moment I walked in, not because anyone ran away, but because people's eyes lingered half a second longer than they should have. I could feel the subtle shift in tone, the way conversations stopped when I approached and resumed once I passed. Nobody wanted to be the first person to ask, because asking makes you responsible for whatever answer you get. They wanted to watch, to gather impressions, to decide whether I looked like the man in Raina's post or the man they actually knew, and I understood that this was the real courtroom now, the hallway, the break room, the elevator, the small spaces where perception gets built without anyone admitting they are building it. I kept my face neutral and moved through the morning as if nothing was happening. I answered messages, attended a routine check-in, nodded through small talk that had lost its warmth, and waited for the HR meeting time, like a man waiting for a train. When the clock reached the hour, I stood, held the packet against my side, and walked to HR with the same pace I used when I carried compliance materials, because pacing matters and anxious pacing looks like guilt. Kira Dunn met me at the door, and her expression was controlled, but her eyes told me she was exhausted already. People rarely understand what HR work actually is because they think HR is about feelings, but it is really about risk management, which means HR is where everyone brings their mess and asks the company to clean it. Kira asked me to come in and sit, and I noticed a second chair positioned slightly angled, like someone else might join us, and I felt my jaw tighten because I could guess who would want to join. Kira did not waste time. She said follow-up concerns had been raised, and she said she needed a clear record so the company could maintain a safe environment. The word safe landed again, but this time it sounded less like a weapon and more like a bureaucratic checkbox, because Kira was trying to keep the machine steady while other people yanked on it. I slid the sealed packet across the desk without any flourish. I told her it was a factual timeline with supporting screenshots, all household-level items tied to my own accounts and publicly available posts, and I told her I had avoided speculation and avoided any illegal access. Kira nodded, opened the packet carefully, and began reviewing the cover page first. I watched her eyes move left to right, and I felt something steady inside me, because no matter what anyone believed emotionally, the documents had a gravity that forced attention. Kira asked a few clarifying questions, and each question was about procedure, not drama. She asked whether the merchant alert was on my account, whether the story tag was publicly visible, whether the doorbell still was from my own property, whether the calendar header was a shared household calendar, and whether the voicemails were received on my phone. I answered each one plainly, and I let the simplicity do its work. She made notes, then placed the packet into a labeled sleeve of her own, the kind of sleeve that looks unremarkable until you realize it represents the moment something becomes official. Then Kira told me something that made the air feel colder. She said a senior HR lead wanted to sit in on the next step because the situation had been escalated. Senior HR lead was a clean phrase for power, and power always has preferences. The senior lead arrived 5 minutes later, and I recognized her from company announcements and compliance briefings because she was the kind of person who wore authority like a tailored suit. Her name was Diane Mercer, and she ran HR compliance in a way that made people speak carefully around her. Diane walked in, greeted Kira with a small nod, then looked at me with the calm curiosity of someone deciding how much of your life they could control with a policy line. Diane asked Kira for the packet and began flipping through it, and I watched the way she read, because I could tell she wasn't reading for empathy. She was reading for vulnerability, reading for the angle that would let the company reduce risk with minimal disruption. When she reached the screenshots of the public story tag and the merchant alert, her eyebrows lifted slightly, then settled, and that small movement mattered because it showed surprise. And surprise in someone like Diane means the story she heard was not matching the evidence. Diane asked if I had responded to Raina publicly. I said I had not. Diane asked if I had contacted any colleagues about Raina's behavior. I said I had not. Diane asked if I had taken any action that could be seen as harassment. I said no, and I told her I had limited my actions to documenting what came to me and what was visible in my own accounts. Diane watched me for a beat longer than Kira did, like she was waiting for a crack, waiting for anger, waiting for a rise in voice. Because if she could see instability, she could justify Raina's narrative without admitting she was doing it. I stayed calm. Diane's questions shifted then, and that shift was subtle but important. She began asking about Grant Hale, not about his role in my marriage, but about his role as a vendor. She asked whether I knew his affiliation. She asked whether I had direct interactions with him. She asked whether I had ever seen him on site. Those questions told me something I hadn't considered until that moment, because Diane wasn't only worried about domestic drama. She was worried about a policy breach that touched the company. I told her I had no direct interaction with Grant beyond what was shown publicly, and I told her I had heard he was present at company-adjacent events. Diane nodded slowly, and I could see the machine inside her mind recalibrating. Domestic mess was one risk. Vendor misconduct was a different kind of risk, the kind that could create liability and embarrassment if it became public. Companies forgive love stories. They do not forgive policy stories. Diane said the evidence would be logged and reviewed, and she said she expected professionalism from all parties. She warned me against any public retaliation, and I almost laughed because she was still operating under the assumption that retaliation means noise. My retaliation had already been built, and it was silent, and it was sitting in her hands inside a labeled sleeve. As the meeting ended, Diane asked Kira to schedule a formal review meeting within a week, and she said it would include relevant stakeholders. The phrase, relevant stakeholders, told me this wasn't staying small. It meant people who had power over contracts, access, and reputation would be involved. It meant Raina's play for public sympathy had just collided with a process that did not care about feelings. I left HR and returned to my desk, and for the first time in days, my breathing felt normal because the burden of being the only person holding reality had shifted. Now HR held it too, and HR did not like being lied to. The next hours were quiet, but not peaceful. Quiet in an office after a rumor starts is not silence, it's tension. I noticed how people looked at me and then looked away. I noticed the way some colleagues tried to overcompensate with kindness, like they wanted to prove they weren't the kind of person who abandons someone under suspicion. I noticed the way others pulled back, because social survival instincts are ugly and honest. And I noticed something else, something that mattered for the next move. I noticed Grant Hale in the hallway near a conference room, holding a visitor badge and talking with someone from procurement. He was not supposed to be there that day, at least not in any way that made sense to me, and the fact that he was there after Raina's post went public felt like a provocation. He stood too relaxed, too comfortable, like a man who believed the building belonged to him. When his eyes met mine, his expression didn't hold guilt. It held amusement, the kind that says he believed I was trapped by decency while he was free to be shameless. I did not confront him. Confrontation would be a gift. Instead, I walked past him without changing my pace, and I watched the smallest thing that could matter later, the visitor badge clipped to his jacket. I noted the color, the placement, and the fact that he was escorted, because escorted means authorized. Authorized means someone with power wanted him present. When I got back to my desk, I wrote one line in my notebook, because this was not evidence yet, but it was a signal. Grant is acting protected. That evening, when I returned home, the neighborhood felt even tighter, like the air had thickened with other people's opinions. A woman across the street, who usually waved, gave me a tight smile and went inside quickly. A car slowed as it passed my house, and I saw a face glance toward my porch, as if verifying a rumor. I hated how quickly a life becomes a spectacle when someone decides to frame you, and I hated that part of me wanted to go outside and correct them, to explain, to prove, to plead. Instead, I went inside, locked the door, and sat at my kitchen table again, because the table had become my war room. My phone buzzed with a message from Mara. She said she saw Raina's post, and she said it looked like a setup. She said the best defense was staying calm and letting the record speak. Then she asked if I had considered that Raina might not be acting alone, and that question hit me harder than it should have, because deep down, I already suspected it. Raina could lie on her own, but this level of coordination, this level of phrase repetition, this level of workplace escalation, it felt like someone smarter was helping her. I stared at my ledger and thought about Diane Mercer's questions about Grant, and I thought about Grant's confidence in the hallway, and I thought about how quickly the situation had escalated in HR. Escalation can happen naturally, but it can also be forced, pushed by someone who wants the process to move in a direction that protects the wrong person. That night, another email arrived in the shared inbox. It wasn't from Raina. It was from an event coordinator for an upcoming corporate donor dinner, the kind of dinner where executives smiled for cameras and people pretended their personal lives were spotless. The email listed seating assignments and mentioned that spouses were encouraged to attend. I recognized the name of the venue, because it was one of those places that makes people feel important just by standing in the lobby. And at the bottom of the email, under special notes, I saw one line that made my stomach go cold. Raina was listed as a host committee liaison for the evening, and Grant Hale was listed as a vendor representative supporting event operations. They were putting them in the same room again, under company lights, with witnesses everywhere. Whether it was arrogance or strategy, I didn't know yet. But I knew what it meant for me. If they were bold enough to stand together in a corporate event, then the next arena wasn't going to be my porch or the airport corridor. The next arena was going to be public, professional, and full of people who mattered. And if Raina believed she could perform her way through it, then she was about to learn what happens when performance meets a logged record. I did not tell anyone I was going to the donor dinner because announcing your plans invites sabotage, and I was done giving Raina openings. I responded to the event email with a simple confirmation that I would attend, and then I did nothing else that could be framed as threatening. If she wanted to tell people she felt unsafe, fine, she could say it into the air all she wanted. But I wanted the actual record to show something different, a man who kept to procedure and showed up where he was supposed to show up. The day of the event, I dressed in the kind of suit that makes you look boring in the best way, because nothing enrages a manipulator more than a target who refuses to look desperate. I kept my posture steady, my face neutral, and my phone charged, not because I planned to record anyone, but because timestamps matter, and phones are good at one thing that liars hate: quietly proving when something happened. As I drove to the venue, I thought about how this story began, with a trip call and a soft voice saying she missed me. I thought about how easy it would have been to believe her if I hadn't received that merchant alert, if I hadn't seen that story tag, if I hadn't trusted the small contradictions. People think betrayal announces itself with drama, but it usually arrives like a receipt, plain, ugly, and undeniable once you look. The venue was a hotel ballroom attached to a lobby that smelled like polished wood and expensive perfume. The kind of place where people speak softly even when they want to scream, because status requires control. I walked in and saw name placards on a registration table, small stacks of programs, and staff moving with practiced efficiency. The room wasn't crowded yet, but it was already alive with anticipation. Because events like this are not about charity. They are about optics, and optics make people act like their lives are flawless. I checked in, took my badge, and accepted a folded program with a polite nod. I scanned the room and saw Kira Dunn near the side, not acting like HR, but acting like someone assigned to quietly monitor risk. I saw Diane Mercer, too, speaking with an executive, posture perfect, eyes sharp. Then I saw Raina, across the lobby near the ballroom doors, and the sight of her hit like an old wound opening because she looked too composed, too confident, like she believed she could glide above consequences if she kept smiling. She wore a dress that looked chosen for impact, not comfort, and her hair was perfect in a way that screamed intention. Beside her stood Grant Hale, holding a small tablet and speaking with a staff member like he belonged there. They were close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and the closeness did not look accidental. Raina noticed me, and her smile tightened, just for a second, then returned, polished and public. Grant looked at me too, and his mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile, more like a private joke. I felt my pulse rise, but I kept my face still, because reactions are what they wanted. If I reacted, I would feed Raina's narrative. If I stayed calm, I would force her to escalate, and escalation makes mistakes. I moved into the ballroom and found my assigned table, then sat without scanning the room like a hunted man. People were already gathering, greeting each other, laughing too loudly, shaking hands, pretending their lives were stable. I recognized a few colleagues and nodded politely, and I could feel the awkwardness in their eyes, the awareness that the rumor cloud had followed me into a place where everyone could see it. The program in my hands was glossy, filled with sponsor logos and smiling headshots, and I flipped it open for one reason only, because sometimes evidence hides in plain sight inside official paper. Near the back, in the list of supporting vendors, I saw Grant Hale's company name printed neatly, and under it, a contact number that matched the merchant alert header from the lounge. It wasn't proof of cheating by itself, but it was a link, a small line that connected his professional presence to the private pattern of spending. I felt something settle in my stomach, because links matter, especially when someone tries to claim everything was personal and unrelated to work. I took a photo of the program page with the vendor list and time-stamped it in my own camera roll, then put the program down and kept my hands still. The event began with soft music and the hum of polite conversation. A host stepped to a microphone and welcomed everyone, then spoke about community impact and corporate responsibility, the usual language that sounds noble while hiding the reality of networking. Plates arrived, glasses clinked, and people leaned in to speak like they were sharing secrets, when most of them were just trading value. Raina moved through the room like a performer, greeting donors, laughing, touching arms lightly, making herself memorable. Grant stayed near the perimeter, acting busy, tablet in hand, occasionally stepping close to her to murmur something, then pulling back. The distance between them was calibrated, enough closeness to feel intimate, enough distance to stay deniable. It was a dance, and they were both good at it. As the night progressed, I noticed something else, something that made my mouth go dry, because it shifted the center of the story again. Diane Mercer kept watching Raina and Grant, not with surprise, but with a careful, controlled attention, like she was monitoring something she already knew. She spoke with Grant briefly near the ballroom doors, and when she did, Grant's posture changed. He straightened. He listened. He nodded. That wasn't the body language of a vendor speaking to a random HR lead. That was the body language of someone receiving instructions from someone who could hurt him. I didn't have proof yet, but I felt the shape of a late twist forming, because the deeper betrayal in stories like this is rarely just sex. It's leverage. The host announced a brief intermission before the donor pledge portion, and people rose from their chairs, drifting toward the lobby for drinks and restroom lines. I used the movement as cover to step toward Kira Dunn, because Kira was the only person in this building whose job required her to care about the record more than the gossip. I approached her calmly and said I wanted to confirm that the review meeting Diane mentioned was still scheduled because the donor dinner was clearly putting involved parties in the same room, and I wanted HR aware of the risk. Kira nodded, eyes flicking toward Diane and then back to me. She said the meeting was scheduled in 2 days, and she said the company wanted a clean process. I asked Kira one simple question, and it was the kind of question that sounds harmless until you realize it forces the listener to confront the truth. I asked whether Grant Hale was officially authorized to be present at this event in the capacity listed in the program. Kira hesitated, then said she believed he was, but she also said the authorization path was not her area, because vendor oversight ran through procurement and senior HR compliance. Senior HR compliance. Diane Mercer. The pieces were shifting closer together. Before Kira could say more, Raina appeared, moving toward us with that same polished expression, like she owned the space. She greeted Kira warmly, then turned to me and did something I expected, but still hated. She lowered her voice slightly, angled her body so others could see her face but not hear her words, and she spoke with the tone of a woman trying to look calm next to a dangerous man. She implied she wanted to talk privately. She implied she was worried about what I might do. She implied she didn't understand why I was trying to ruin her. Kira's eyes narrowed slightly, not in judgment of me, but in annoyance at the obvious staging, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in that, because Kira was not a friend. She was a professional, and professionals hate being used as props. I responded with the same method I had used at the airport. I did not argue. I did not defend myself emotionally. I asked Raina to confirm one date and one location related to the merchant alert, and I asked it in a calm, procedural voice, because I wanted Kira to hear the difference between questions and accusations. Raina's smile faltered for half a second, then she tried to redirect, claiming the details didn't matter, claiming the context was complicated, claiming I was obsessed. Kira asked her to answer the question. Hearing that was like hearing a lock click. Raina's eyes flashed with irritation, then she gave an answer that was vague enough to be flexible, but specific enough to be tested, and Kira's face tightened again, because vagueness is a red flag in any official process. Raina tried to regain control by saying she felt uncomfortable. Then she glanced toward Grant as if seeking backup. Grant stepped closer. He did not touch her, but his proximity was protective, and it was public. Kira watched the movement, and I saw her mind record it without writing it down. Diane Mercer watched too, and Diane's expression didn't change, which was the most telling reaction of all. Raina excused herself quickly, pulling Grant with her under the pretense of event coordination, and the moment they left, Kira spoke in a quieter voice. She said the review meeting would address conduct concerns with documentation, and she said she wanted me to stay professional and avoid any scene tonight. I told her I would, because the scene was not mine to create. The intermission ended, and the pledge portion began. The host asked for attention, donors quieted, and a screen behind the stage displayed the charity's goals. People began pledging, smiling as they announced numbers, as if generosity was a performance, which it often is. I sat still, watched the room, and waited, because I could feel Raina building towards something, She wouldn't let this night end without trying to reclaim control. Near the end, the host thanked the host committee liaisons, and Raina's name was mentioned. She walked toward the stage with practiced grace, smiling as people clapped politely. She stood near the host, posture perfect, and I realized what she was doing in that instant. She was placing herself in a spotlight with witnesses everywhere because she wanted the last image of the night to be her looking respected, admired, safe. Then she turned slightly, scanning the room, and her eyes landed on me, and in her expression I saw the calculation sharpen. She didn't need to accuse me directly. She only needed to hint, to frame, to suggest. She began speaking to the host in a way that made him nod, and I saw him glance down at a card like he was preparing to say something written. My skin went cold, because written words in a public room can become a weapon fast. The host raised his voice again, and I saw him gesture lightly toward me, as if inviting some acknowledgement, some polite recognition, some forced participation that would trap me on stage in their story. I didn't know exactly what he was about to say, but I knew it would be designed to make me look like the problem if I refused. I stood slowly, not abruptly, and I moved toward the aisle, not toward the stage because I would not be pulled into their choreography. As I walked, I felt eyes tracking me, felt the room's attention lean in the way it does when people sense drama. Raina's smile tightened again, and Grant shifted near the side of the stage like he was ready to intervene, ready to block, ready to manage. I reached the edge of the ballroom near the lobby, and my phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a calendar conflict header from the shared household calendar, a new event added while I sat in this room, titled in a bland way that sounded like logistics, but the location field contained the same waterfront address tied to the merchant alerts, scheduled for tomorrow morning. She was still doing it, even now, even while standing on stage. And that single calendar line told me the worst truth of all, because it wasn't just proof of betrayal, it was proof of contempt. I stared at the notification until my vision sharpened. Then I took a screenshot and saved it, because it was another clean piece for the record, another small truth in the thousand that would collapse her scaffolding. Then I looked back into the ballroom and saw the host waiting, the room quiet, Raina smiling like a saint, and Grant watching like a man who believed he was untouchable. 2 days, Kira had said. 2 days until the review meeting. But Raina was trying to force the climax sooner, in a room full of donors and cameras and status. I felt my mouth curl into the smallest smile, because she didn't realize what she had just handed me. She didn't realize she had just proven she would keep lying even under spotlight, and that meant the next step wasn't just HR procedure anymore. The next step was choosing the exact moment to let the room witness the truth, without me ever raising my voice. By the time I got home, the house felt like it had been holding its breath all day, and the silence inside it sounded less like peace and more like a witness refusing to blink. I set my keys down in the same dish I always used, not because routines mattered now, but because consistency was the only thing still under my control. I opened my evidence folder, saved the calendar conflict screenshot from the ballroom, then wrote one line beneath it in my ledger, because every new lie deserved a clean place to die. I checked the doorbell cam timeline on my own account, not to spy on her, but to confirm my own memory of the hours, because memory is where liars like to rent space. I saw nothing unusual yet, and that detail mattered too, because I wanted the record to show I was not hunting her, I was simply keeping my own house in order. Then I sat at the kitchen table and waited, because I already knew she would not let the night end without trying to force a private scene that she could later describe as proof. She arrived after midnight, and I did not hear her car first. I heard the change in the street, the quiet shift of tires on wet pavement, the way an engine idles when someone isn't sure how they want to enter. The doorbell cam caught her walking up with a suitcase and a posture that looked rehearsed, like she had practiced being tired and innocent in a mirror. She stood at the door for a second, as if deciding whether to knock softly or loudly. Then she knocked the way someone knocks when they want the whole street to know they tried. I did not open immediately because I wanted the timestamp to speak before any emotion did. I waited long enough for the doorbell cam to record the full moment. Then I opened the door with my face still, my shoulders relaxed, and my body angled so she could not slip past me without making it obvious. She tried to move into the house like she still owned the space, and I stepped slightly to the side without stepping back, because there is a difference between letting someone in and letting someone take ground. She started talking fast, the way guilty people talk when they think speed can replace truth. She tried to explain the trip, tried to explain the message she had sent, tried to explain why she was suddenly here instead of finishing her schedule, and I watched her eyes flick toward my phone on the counter as if she expected it to be recording her. I let her talk for a minute, because the most useful thing a liar can do is show you what version of reality they are trying to sell. When she paused, waiting for my reaction, I did not argue. I did not tell her what I knew. I did not perform anger for her so she could label it later. I asked her to confirm one simple detail about tomorrow morning, because the shared calendar had just announced it as if it were a harmless errand. She looked at me like she didn't understand the question. Then she tried to laugh it off. Then she tried to pivot into something emotional about missing me, and I watched the pivot fail because she had overused it. I asked again, calmly, and her face tightened, and she said it was nothing important, just a quick meeting, just logistics, just a last-minute change. She tried to make it sound normal, but normal does not get added to a shared calendar while someone is standing under stage lights trying to manage a narrative. Normal does not hide behind vague titles and familiar excuses. She realized she was losing control, and she switched tactics quickly, moving from soft affection to wounded offense, because she needed me either begging or yelling, and I was giving her neither. She asked why I had blocked her, and I did not answer with feelings. I answered with the same dryness I used in HR, because I wanted the record inside my own mind to stay clean. I told her I had seen enough to stop participating in her story, and I told her I would not be discussing it in the doorway or the kitchen, because any discussion would become a weapon. That made her angry, not because she wanted resolution, but because she wanted a fight she could control. She tried to step closer, as if proximity could force a response, and I stepped back just enough to keep distance without making it look like fear. Then I did the one thing she hated most, because it denied her the stage she needed. I told her she could sleep in the guest room if she wanted, but I would not share a bed with someone who kept scheduling lies like appointments. She stormed down the hall, and I heard drawers open and close, and I heard her moving items as if she was searching for something, as if she believed she could find and destroy my proof the way she destroyed her own credibility. She came back holding my old notebook, the one I used for work notes, and she asked why I was writing things down like an investigator. I took the notebook from her, without yanking, without force, without raising my voice, because calm is a wall that makes frantic people look worse. She said she could call people and tell them what kind of man I was. She said she could make this ugly. She said she could ruin my reputation at work. I let her talk, then I said one sentence that mattered more than anything else, because it was the truth she couldn't spin. I told her she had already tried, and it had already been logged, and it had already reached the people who handle risk for a living. She went quiet then, but it wasn't the quiet of remorse. It was the quiet of calculation. She asked what I meant, and I told her the company was reviewing documented conduct and vendor boundary issues, and I told her it wasn't about our marriage anymore. It was about her choices colliding with policy. I watched that land in her face like a slap, because she had spent years believing policies were for other people, and now she was realizing policies were built to protect institutions from people exactly like her. She tried one last angle, softer again, saying we could talk privately and work through it, because she didn't want her career touched. That was the mid-story truth finally visible, because her fear was never losing me. It was losing her image, I asked her if she wanted me or wanted the stability my silence provided, and she answered without words, because her eyes went to the hallway where her phone was charging, as if she was already thinking about messages she needed to send. I told her I would be leaving early in the morning for the scheduled review meeting, and I told her I expected her to do nothing that would add to her file. Then I went into the guest room myself and closed the door, because I refused to let her have even the symbolic victory of pushing me out. I slept lightly, the way you sleep when you know someone in the house is still trying to build a story around you. In the morning, she was already dressed, already moving with purpose, already preparing to enact the calendar lie she had placed in the shared schedule. She acted like we were normal, like the night before hadn't happened, like I was a husband who would be too embarrassed to stop her. I didn't stop her. I didn't chase her. I didn't block the door. I watched her leave, because the best way to catch someone in a lie is to let them walk into it with confidence. As she drove off, my phone buzzed with a merchant alert from my own account, and the timing was perfect in the ugliest way. The alert showed a purchase at a cafe near the waterfront address in the calendar entry, and the amount was small enough to look harmless, the kind of small payment people use to disguise bigger meetings. I saved the notification, then printed it at work later, because paper becomes real in rooms where liars depend on digital fog. The review meeting was set for late morning, and it was held in a glass-walled conference room that made privacy feel like a suggestion. Kira Dunn was there with a laptop and a folder. Diane Mercer was there with her controlled posture and her practiced neutrality, and two other people were present who I recognized from procurement and vendor management, because this was no longer an HR gossip issue. It was a vendor risk issue wrapped in a domestic scandal. They asked me to summarize my concerns, and I did it the same way I had done it before, with a timeline, not a speech. I stated the pattern in plain terms, then I referenced the household-level proofs that supported it, because the moment you stay factual, you force everyone else to either be factual too or look like they are hiding something. Kira placed my updated evidence sleeve on the table, and I saw the procurement manager glance at the merchant alerts with visible discomfort, because nobody likes seeing a company-adjacent vendor show up inside someone's personal spending trail. Diane tried to steer the conversation toward professionalism and away from personal implications, and I understood why, because Diane's job was to keep the company clean. I also understood that Diane was now balancing two fires at once, because if she admitted the vendor connection was messy, she would have to admit she hadn't controlled it earlier. If she pretended it was purely personal, procurement would call her bluff, because procurement cares about liability more than reputations. They asked whether I had any evidence that Grant Hale had misused access or violated policy, and I said I had no privileged access evidence and had not attempted to obtain any. Then I placed the donor program vendor list page on the table beside the merchant alerts, because the connection didn't prove a policy breach by itself, but it established that the same name existed in both worlds at the same time. I added the calendar conflict header screenshot, because it showed intent in scheduling, and intent matters when someone claims everything was accidental. Then I gave them the doorbell cam still frame from my own doorway, the one that showed Raina arriving home after midnight with a suitcase, because it demonstrated a timeline contradiction with her public narrative about being exhausted and safe and needing space. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't invasive. It was simply a time-stamped fact from my own home. Kira took notes. The procurement manager's face tightened. Diane's expression stayed controlled, but her fingers pressed against the table in a way that told me she was irritated, not at me, but at the evidence refusing to stay small. They asked if I had any witness confirmation, and I said I did, but only in the most lawful way possible, because I had not recruited anyone. I had only accepted what people gave when asked simple questions. I presented a one-line email confirmation from the hotel front desk, showing payer name and checkout time for the waterfront lounge night, with no room details and no private information, because I had been the account holder responsible for the charge. That single line landed hard, because it turned a he said she said into a the payer record says. Diane asked whether I was seeking disciplinary action against my wife, and the question was framed to make me look petty. I answered in a way that was both honest and strategic. I said I was seeking a clean record because false narratives had already been spread, and I wanted the company to handle vendor risk and workplace conduct with consistency. I said I wasn't asking for revenge because revenge is emotional, and this was simply consequence. That answer made Diane pause because she had expected rage, and rage would have been easier to dismiss. They told me they would be interviewing Raina and Grant separately and would follow policy for conflicts and vendor boundaries. They told me to avoid direct contact and to keep things professional. Then they ended the meeting with the kind of polite neutrality that usually means decisions will be made behind closed doors. I walked out of the conference room and felt the office air hit my face, dry and recycled, like a building that never truly breathes. I returned to my desk and waited, because waiting is part of my method too, and it is the part that destroys people who believe intimidation wins. 2 hours later, Kira sent a meeting invite labeled follow-up review, and it included Diane, procurement, and legal counsel, which meant the machine had decided it couldn't ignore the risk anymore. The meeting was set for the next day, and the location field contained the same conference room, but now the stakes were higher, because legal does not show up for feelings. That evening, Raina called again from a number I didn't recognize, and I did not answer, because unanswered calls are not a weakness when you already have a record. She left a voicemail anyway, and I saved the timestamp screenshot without listening, because the content wasn't the point. The point was that she was still trying to force emotion into a process that had moved beyond her. When I got home, she was already there, waiting in the living room with her posture stiff and her eyes sharp. She acted like we were in negotiations, like marriage was a contract she could renegotiate with a few dramatic lines. She asked what I had done, and I said I had done what she refused to do, which was tell the truth in a room that required it. She asked if I was trying to ruin her, and I told her she had ruined herself by choosing the same lie in 100 small ways. Then she said something that finally revealed the real structure beneath her confidence. She implied Diane Mercer could make this go away. That was the mid-story twist fully exposed, because Raina wasn't just relying on charm, she was relying on protection. She wasn't just cheating with Grant, she was operating inside an ecosystem where someone in power could smooth the edges, edit the story, and keep consequences away. I looked at her and said nothing, because silence in that moment was more violent than any argument. It forced her to fill the space, and she did, explaining too much, insisting Diane understood the situation, insisting Diane would handle it, insisting I was making a mistake by pushing. She realized she was talking herself into a corner, then stopped, then tried to soften again, telling me we could fix this, telling me she still cared. I asked her one final question before I went to bed, and it was the same kind of question I used in HR, because simple questions are traps for complex lies. I asked whether she had scheduled that waterfront meeting in the shared calendar to hide it or to normalize it. She didn't answer. She didn't need to, because the answer was written on her face, and her face was tired of acting. I slept again behind a closed door, and I woke up knowing the next day would decide everything, because the machine had been triggered, and machines do not care about love stories when liability is involved. The next morning, the office felt like a corridor leading to a courtroom, even though nobody called it that. People were quieter than usual, and the quiet wasn't respectful, it was hungry. Rumors had created a shadow, and shadows draw eyes. I walked through it without changing my pace, because the moment you hurry, people decide you are running from something. Kira met me outside the conference room and nodded without smiling, because she was in professional mode now, the kind of mode that means she will not protect you with warmth. She will protect the process with precision. Diane Mercer was inside already, seated near the head of the table, and beside her sat the procurement manager, a legal counsel I hadn't met, and a vendor compliance officer with a laptop open like a weapon. Raina arrived last, and she did it with intention, because late entrances are a form of control. She came in with her chin lifted and her expression calm, like she had rehearsed innocence overnight. Grant Hale was not present, and that absence mattered, because it meant he was either being interviewed separately or being kept away to limit exposure. Raina's eyes flicked toward me for a second, then away, because she wanted to pretend I was irrelevant. Diane opened the meeting with procedural language about conduct, safety, and policy compliance, and I listened carefully, because the way people frame things tells you what outcome they want. Diane emphasized the need to avoid personal conflict and maintain workplace integrity, and it sounded clean, but it also sounded like a narrowing of the issue, like she wanted to keep it inside a safe box where she could control the result. The legal counsel explained that the purpose of the meeting was to document facts and determine appropriate action under policy, and that sentence was the first thing I heard that day that felt like truth without decoration. Procurement then stated that vendor interactions and potential conflicts of interest were being reviewed, and I watched Raina's shoulders stiffen slightly, because vendor conflict was not a romantic narrative, it was a career threat. They asked Raina to provide her account of events. She began with the same soft framing from her public post, the same implication that I was unstable, the same suggestion that her distance was for safety. She spoke carefully, using words borrowed from therapy jargon and corporate training slides. She tried to paint herself as responsible and restrained, and she tried to paint me as controlling without saying the word. Then legal counsel asked for specificity, and the room changed. They asked her to confirm dates, times, and locations related to the vendor program, the donor dinner, and the waterfront meeting on the shared calendar. Raina answered with vague phrasing at first, then tightened her answers when pressed, because vagueness dies quickly in rooms with lawyers. The vendor compliance officer pulled up a record on the laptop. I did not see the screen, but I saw Raina's eyes widen a fraction, then narrow again. The compliance officer stated that Grant Hale had used a vendor badge to enter a restricted event operations zone at the donor dinner outside his approved scope, and that the badge access had been requested through a chain of approval that included senior HR compliance, Diane Mercer's chain. I watched Diane's face stay smooth, but I saw the small tell in her jaw, the way it clenched and released like someone swallowing anger. The compliance officer then stated that Grant's vendor account had been flagged weeks earlier for boundary concerns, but the escalation had been delayed pending internal review. The phrasing was polite, but the meaning was brutal. Someone had slowed the machine. Legal counsel asked Diane to clarify her involvement in the badge authorization, and Diane gave a controlled answer about operational needs and event coordination. She framed it as routine. She framed it as harmless. She framed it as something any competent compliance lead might do. Then procurement asked why a vendor with a flagged file was granted expanded access, and Diane's answer tightened again, because procurement doesn't care about performance. Procurement cares about exposure. Diane said she had acted on incomplete information and had prioritized event continuity. She tried to make it sound like a noble choice. Raina looked at Diane as if expecting rescue, and that look confirmed everything. This was not just an affair. This was a protected affair. The late twist snapped into place when legal counsel stated that an internal complaint had been logged, and that the record included my documented timeline and also included independent event staff notes from the donor dinner. The staff notes were not mine. That mattered, because it meant the truth had been noticed by neutral eyes, and neutral eyes are hard to discredit. Raina tried to pivot then, attempting to separate her personal life from workplace impact. She tried to claim she had only interacted with Grant in the context of event coordination. She tried to frame the waterfront meeting as a vendor check-in. She tried to make the merchant alerts look like routine expenses. She tried to paint the calendar conflict as a scheduling accident. Legal counsel asked her why she had posted a public narrative implying safety concerns while simultaneously coordinating private meetings in off hours, and the room went silent in the way it does when someone finally asks the question that makes the lie collapse. Raina attempted to answer, but the words came out tangled because she needed two realities to be true at once, and the table would not allow it. Kira Dunn placed my updated evidence sleeve on the table without flair, like she was laying down a tool, not a weapon. She stated the evidence had been received and logged, and she stated it consisted of household-level artifacts tied to my own accounts and publicly visible records. Then she opened the sleeve and handed each person a single-page timeline summary, a neutral grid of dates, places, and payments, with no commentary, because commentary invites debate. Dates and payments do not. Raina's eyes moved across the page and her breathing changed. She tried to hold her posture, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. Diane reached for her copy too quickly, and that speed told me she was realizing the damage was now distributed, no longer contained in her hands. The vendor compliance officer then stated that Grant Hale would have his vendor access revoked pending final determination and that his company's contract status would be reviewed. The words were clinical, but the effect was immediate, because in corporate spaces, access is oxygen. Raina's face turned toward Diane again, and I saw the moment she understood she was not protected anymore. Diane was not looking at her like an ally now. Diane was looking at her like a liability, because the machine had turned, and now Diane needed distance. Legal counsel asked for any additional statements, and Raina tried one last time to redirect toward me, implying I was acting out of spite, implying I was obsessed, implying I was trying to control her. I did not respond emotionally because emotional responses are mud, and I was done stepping in mud. I stated one sentence, calm and flat, and it ended her story in that room. I had blocked her only after documented evidence arrived, and she had rushed home only when her cover collapsed, not when her feelings changed. Legal counsel nodded once, not approving me, but acknowledging logic. Then Diane tried to close the meeting quickly, steering toward vague next steps and confidentiality, because she wanted to stop the bleeding. Procurement interrupted and demanded a clear action plan for vendor risk and internal accountability. Legal counsel stated an internal finding would be issued, and leadership would be informed of policy breaches, including improper badge authorization and conflicts of interest. Kira asked Raina to confirm whether she had disclosed her relationship with Grant as required by policy. That question was a guillotine disguised as paperwork. Raina hesitated. She tried to say there was no relationship. She tried to say it was professional. She tried to say it was misinterpreted. The compliance officer calmly stated that Grant's phone number was listed as a contact on a charity pledge card associated with Raina's committee role, and that it matched an internal record captured by event staff. That detail wasn't mine. That detail was the building's own witness, and it removed her last shelter. Raina went pale. Diane's face tightened. Legal counsel summarized next steps with a tone that sounded like finality. Grant's access revoked immediately. An ethics review regarding Diane's decisions. Raina placed on administrative leave pending outcome, and any further public posts violating policy could lead to termination for cause. Raina looked at me with disbelief, because she had built her whole strategy around me acting like the man she described online. I stayed still, and I let her stare at the wrong character. When the meeting ended, Kira collected the copies and labeled the sleeve with a case number that was now part of the company's bloodstream. Diane left without looking at me, because acknowledgement would mean admitting she had underestimated someone she assumed was powerless. Raina walked out shakily, no longer a liaison, but a person whose audience had turned into a jury. An hour later, she appeared at my desk, eyes red, voice soft, trying to pull me into privacy where she could reshape the story again. I stood up and told her the only conversations left would be through attorneys and mediators. She tried to say she never meant to hurt me, tried to say she felt trapped, but that was the final refuge of someone who has lost their narrative. That evening, the house was quiet again, but the quiet felt different now, less like a witness holding breath and more like a verdict settling into place. A courier envelope slid through the mail slot. Grant Hale's company removed from upcoming events pending review, signed and dated. It wasn't my revenge. It was the institution protecting itself, and that was the most satisfying justice of all. I placed the notice into a clear sleeve, wrote the date, and set it beside my ledger like a final stone on a grave. She had believed speed could fix betrayal, that tears could rewrite timestamps, that protection could outlast proof. She was wrong on every count. And now, with the record logged and the minutes kept, there was nothing left for her to hide behind, because the scaffolding she built had finally fallen in front of the only audience that matters, the people who keep minutes.